as I said, the pressures from the south and from the north were getting great. And because he was weak, he was deposed by the Pharaoh of Egypt, and he was even carted off into Egypt. Even trying to make friends with Egypt didn't work for him. He was replaced with Jehoiakim, who was on the throne for 12 years, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all his fathers had done. And he focused primarily on making nice with Egypt, realizing his survivability had depended on Egypt, and so we're gonna make nice with them. And the advisors and the prophets that had spoken to his father Josiah were trying to tell him to warn him, and he had no patience with them at all. He says, "Get out of here! I don't want to listen to you." We tried that. That's the line that people will often say. We tried that, didn't work. We got to go in a different direction. In 605 is a very classic battle at Carchemish. You maybe have heard of this in history studies. Classic battle between Egypt and Babylonia at Carchemish. Egypt goes right past Jerusalem and attacks the Babylonians at Carchemish, and King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon defeats the Egyptians there. I think I have that right. And as a result of that, they chase them back to Egypt, and on the way they stop at Jerusalem. "Oh, you're an Egyptian puppet, aren't you?" And so that historically is referred to as the first visit to Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar comes knocking on the door of Jerusalem and says, "Well, we're going to need you on our side from now on." And so when he did that, he took lots of things with him, lots of riches, lots of young people. One of them was Daniel. That was when Daniel was hauled off to Babylonia. And in 601, Egypt rises up again, defends its borders against Babylon, and begins to pressure Jerusalem again. And Jehoiakim reaches out, tries to settle with Egypt again. And Nebuchadnezzar hears about this, and he starts to come down to Jerusalem again. But Jehoiakim conveniently dies, so he doesn't have to face him. And that means that Jehoiakim, who is actually the older son of Joash, is made king. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all the fathers had done. And he was less than 1 year in reign. Egypt never came to his rescue. Babylonia did come for visit number 2. And Nebuchadnezzar takes Jehoiakim from the throne, and others, including Ezekiel, is now taken captive back to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar puts his uncle Zedekiah on the throne. "You're going to do what I'm going to tell you to do. You're going to act in my behalf for Babylonia." And then he leaves. Zedekiah manages to balance both pressures for 11 years. And but the summation of him is he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all Jehoiakim had done. And when it looks bad, he favors Egypt. Egypt's closer. Politically, it just makes more sense. He's going to favor Egypt again. And at that time, Jeremiah is taken to Egypt, and Babylonia's had enough, and they come down for visit number 3. Visit number 3 is when they lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, and the city falls in 587 BC. It is horrific. It is an absolute destruction of the city, of its people, of the temple. It is brutal. There is no mercy given anywhere at all. The city is totally destroyed. Zedekiah is blinded after watching his sons be murdered before him. He's deported to Babylon. Jerusalem and the temple are burned to the ground. All the precious articles and many of the captives were taken back into Babylon to be sold as slaves. This is such a horrific destruction that you really need to get into that mentality in terms of what it meant to be a Jew in those days to really understand the Book of Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations is a lament Lamentations, lament. It is a woe be us for what has happened. And Lamentations traditionally is claimed to be authored by Jeremiah. None of these books, well, not none of these books, several of these books, of course, are anonymous. We know how Solomon is claimed, a couple of them. We know how he disguised his name for Ecclesiastes. Lamentations is actually it's anonymous. There is only a reference to it in one form, and that's in the book of Jeremiah. And only in the later Greek translation of the Old Testament and not the older Hebrew scriptures. So it's a little bit confusing as to how that happens, but nonetheless, that is why traditionally we attribute the writing of Lamentations to Jeremiah. In the book of Jeremiah, he laments greatly about the fall of Jerusalem, so it makes sense to put the two together. And the book of Jeremiah fills us in on the details of the fall much more explicitly even than the book of Lamentations does. The book of Lamentations bears witness to the fall of Jerusalem. It comes across like an eyewitness account. And so that is the main reason why people think it wasn't written many years later by somebody else writing historically. It reads like someone who saw this happen and whose heart is torn out because of it. It's an emotional, it's a passionate book. And it's not just news. It's writing about the unbelievable devastation and destruction, not just of a city and not just of a people, but of an entire religion. It starts off absolutely hopeless. And this is the destruction of Judaism, of all that God had done with and for the people of God in terms of his miracles, in terms of his providential care, in terms of the Exodus, in terms of the promised land, in terms of all of that had happened and taken place. And this comes across immediately at the beginning with just utter devastation. And so the destruction is physical, it's psychological, and it's spiritual. But interestingly enough, it is also different than the book of Job, and for one very significant reason. And that is that in Job, we're wrestling with suffering that we don't know where it's coming from. We're wrestling with suffering that we don't know why we're suffering. And you work through that. And how is it that God has brought this upon us? And that's what the book is trying to come to grips with. Lamentations is very different. Lamentations is, we know why this has happened. We know very well why this has happened. And so that is part of the grief. Our own sinfulness has brought this to bear. Our own presumption upon God, day after day after day after day, year after year after year, generation after generation after generation, giving away everything that mattered to our faith, compromising one thing after another until we were no different at all from the pagans around us, abusing the commandments of God and the corporate worship process of God so much that it meant nothing. In fact, it was just a mockery of everything that Judaism was supposed to mean. It comes because we earned it, you might say. And so there's a very significant difference between the two books. And that is one of the reasons why Lamentations is such an emotional book. How far we have fallen, how far we have given up, how far we have surrendered, how much we deserve this. The structure of the book of Lamentations is the first sign of I won't say hope, but of continued faithfulness. When you notice in the English, you don't see this, and this is a real. There's several books in the Old Testament that are like this. You miss a great deal in the translation because you don't get it in the Hebrew. But in the Hebrew, there is a significant order to the book in terms of acrostic organization. Acrostic organization is the alphabetical start of the meter, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and every line starts with the next letter in the alphabet. And Proverbs 31 is written acrostically, and the idea is that mothers can teach this to their children, and they can memorize it because they just go through the alphabet and they know the next line. And there's several places in Scripture which do that as kind of an aid to do that, and it makes a very handy way to memorize things. Lamentations is acrostic in a depth and a fullness that it beats everything else in Hebrew Scripture. It's 5 chapters where it's organized very sophisticatedly in this. And the suggestion is that it's not just for memorization. It's not like you're trying to memorize Lamentations. Memorizing Proverbs 31 is one thing. Memorizing Lamentations, teaching your child it may have merit to it, but it makes much more sense to understand that this is how Lamentations was to be sung. This was created to be part of the worship of the exilic people. Now, if it's to be sung, what are we saying? If Judaism is over, if it's done, if there's nothing left, if God's punishment has been complete, if he slams the door on that and it's over, why are we singing Lamentations? And the only answer that makes any sense is that they're worshiping a God who is still there. And he is not done. And so we're pouring out our hearts in attrition, in confession, in repentance. We deserve everything we got, as bad as it was, and our hope is still in the Lord. That is significant. That is very significant, because that's going to make a big difference. In other words, for all intents and purposes, it was organized for forms of corporate worship. It was presented for and by the singing of choirs. We're trying to we're singing more and more of the Psalms. Because I'm discovering this Trinity Psalter hymnal, and I'm trying to work that in. And you know from the Psalms that not every one of them is just joyful and happy and boy, we're glad to be here. There are psalms of lament in the Psalter. And it is proper at times of corporate mourning to sing a song of lament, to cry out that the Lord has dealt with us in a harsh way, and yet we worship God. It's a very strong lesson that we need to be reinforced with. This, I think, separates, to a great extent, traditional Judaism to contemporary Christianity, which is so self-centered these days. We come to worship with thousands of God people. We watch the stage. We're entertained with the music, and they sing the greatest upbeat things they can think of. The sermons are light and fluffy, and we're there to talk to each other and integrate. And yet, if they turned and did something like this, the crowd would disappear. This is not entertaining. This is not uplifting. I came to be uplifted. And so, the Psalms remind us that there is full-orbed emotion to the human being that is wrapped up in the Psalter. Every emotion that we go through, joy, happiness, thrill, anger, wrath, misery, heartache, it's all there. And it's there to be sung and prayed back to God, because that is what we do as His people. We know that no matter what happened to us, no matter what has befalled our nation, no matter what might happen here and there and the other place, God is still on the throne. And that's an important thing for us to hold on to. There's a remarkable number, one commentator points out there's a remarkable number of figures of speech. It's written to be compared to other things in life and to identify with the kinds of depth that we have in life in other circumstances. And so there's a remarkable number of figures of speech. And the meter in the original Hebrew, again, you missed this in English, is 3-2. It has a nickname. All these meters have names, you know, but this one has a nickname. It's called the limping meter. And the idea is that when you read it, you feel like you're walking with a limp. It's not something happy. It's not something march-like. It falls short of that. I picked out a few verses that I think kind of fit that in English. Not completely, but you get the idea. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They become her enemies. You see what I mean? When you read it in the Hebrew, it just comes out loud and clear. And there is a beat. There's a slap in the face with every line that kind of sets you back. And it's meant to poetically impose that sorrow on you as you read it. As far as structure goes, it's again very unique and kind of odd. The structure is prose-like. It's almost like telling a story, but there's no drama and there's no flow to the single storyline. It starts off in the first chapter talking about the destruction of the city. The wrath of God follows that. There is a climax in the middle of the book. And it deals with the compassions of God. Compassions of God. See how far he had to come to get there, though. But then, instead of settling down just with a song of hope, the sins of all classes follow that. No one's without sin here. No one's without excuse or with excuse. And then the prayer at the end, which is rather pitiful, and help us, Lord, and it just kind of leaves it there, a plea for divine mercy. And so the focal point, no matter where you are in this, draws you toward the middle. It's the middle of the book where you stop, where you hold on to, where you reorganize your thoughts, and you have the strength to move on. And so it's oftentimes referred to, the 4 and 5 section, as, the overall thing we have to address and the future. There is going to be a future. The people of exile of Jerusalem don't have the slightest idea what that's going to be like, but God's not done. And that's all they know. That's all they know. And so the theological message, I'll put it this way, the theological message of Lamentations is God himself has punished Judah. We don't blame Babylon. We aren't blaming the contest with Egypt. We're not even blaming our lousy, stinking kings. We know we're all at fault. We have all sinned. And we know that this is God's judgment on Judah. Sin has caused this. Faith cannot be brashly replaced with presumption or pride. It's a return to faith in God over all things. Over all things. It's a call back to radical orthodoxy. And because of that, because the call is to a radical return to obedience, to faith and obedience, then the reason for that is there must be hope. There must still be hope. And you remember I said it with Job, that in Job's struggles, what really gave Job the faith he needed to get through was to realize that he didn't worship a fatalism. It wasn't just some kind of faceless cause that was doing these things to him that he had no ability to grasp. Job's struggles actually put a face on God, if I can use that term. There really is a person who is dealing with me. And that made all the difference to him. You remember? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. It's not just, things happen. Whatever goes around comes around. No, that's fatalism. God is at work here, and I'm dealing with God. Well, Lamentations gives us that same face. This isn't just fatalism. This is God that's dealing with me here, that's dealing with us here, and that's an important thing. And we know that if nothing else, his plan to redemption will go forward. And so it's no wonder that in the heart, the climax of chapter 3 of Lamentations, you have that well-known verse, "Great is your faithfulness." Did you know that's where that comes from? You know, we sing that hymn based on this verse. Go back and read those words. There's nothing in there about struggle. There's nothing in there about heartache. Nothing in there about our own sins and our own need to come back to God. It's just celebrating. I mean, I love the hymn, okay? But it's just celebrating our relationship with God and our walk with God. Lots of man-written hymns do that. They take a verse that is so precious out of context and they plop it over here and they just make frilly stuff out of it. And we really need to do better. If we're going to put the face of God into our worship, we need to do better. Okay, getting back to history. Here is the breakdown of the chronological breakdown of what's going on. You've got the fall of Samaria to Assyria. Then you've got the 3 captivities of Babylon and the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. And then after that, Babylonia itself falls to Medo-Persia in 538. These nations just get bigger and bigger and bigger. Assyria fell to Babylon. Babylon falls to Medo-Persia. But by 536, you have the first of the 3 returns of the Jews to the Promised Land. The first one is under the leadership of a man named Zerubbabel. The second return is in 458, and that's the second return of the Jews with Ezra. And the third return of the Jews is 445 with Nehemiah in the lead. And it's right about there that the story of Esther takes place. Okay? Now, Esther is referred to as the most unique book, the most unusual book in the entire Bible. And it's for several reasons. One, of course, is that most prominent is that there is no mention of God at all. God's not named, God's not mentioned, God's not described. The sacrifices of the worship of God are not mentioned. None of the hymns, psalms are sung. There's no prayers to God. There's no reference to God at all. And its origin of the book seems to be teaching you the origin of the holiday of Purim, which I'll mention a little bit, is a holiday of celebrating the Lord's salvation and rescue. And it's a holiday that started in exile. And it seems like the book of Esther is written for that purpose, to tell us where that holiday came from. But the thing that catches your eye is that the literary structure of Esther, which claims to be history, is saturated with poetic structure and style. So much so that it has to be deliberately built that way. The use of irony, satire, recurring motifs make you lean heavily toward the idea that this is just fiction, or at least it's a very fictionalized telling of an historical tale. Let me show you what I mean. Irony. Irony is deliberately laced into the book in several ways. There are frequent reversals of fortune. Haman seeks to destroy Mordecai, ends up destroying himself. Haman's edict to plunder the Jews ends up reversing, and he's plundered. Haman's script to glorify himself actually is turned around to glorify Mordecai. Haman's control of the royal signet is given to Mordecai. Everything that Haman plots turns over. He has no control of it. There's smaller examples of that, but I'll touch on those. Satire also shows up, and the ladies always particularly like this. The satire is built in terms of magnifying female or feminine assertiveness. The king decrees that men should rule their houses, and then he can't even get his own wife to cooperate. The ruler of a vast and powerful enemy is dictated to by his wives. An entire bureaucracy surrounds the choice of a royal partner for the king, while strong women effectively control the actions of their husbands. The king wants to make a spectacle of his wife, winds up making a spectacle of himself. That's pretty common, isn't it, guys? The vaunted monarch whose law cannot be changed, remember, the law of the Medes and Persians can't be changed, is told what to do by his wife. And so he's finessed and manipulated. So the satire is deliberately laced into the book as well. Then you've got all kinds of recurring motifs, themes that come back not only just once or twice, but in pairs or in triplets, designed literarily very carefully so that you see this again and again and again. Drinking and banqueting or fasting always is a time in the book where the twist in the plot occurs. It's always a banquet or a fast where something significant happens. Items of apparel are continually significant. There is pervasive concern for law, for precedent, and for legality. The intentional pairings I mentioned here, look at this. Esther conceals her identity twice. 3 groups of banquets come in pairs. There are 2 lists of king's servants, 2 gatherings of women, 2 houses for women, 2 fasts, 2 consultations by Haman with others, 2 unscheduled appearances by Esther before the king, 2 investitures of Mordecai, 2 times Haman's face is covered, 2 references to Haman's sons, 2 appearances to Harbona, 2 references to the subsiding of the king's anger, 2 references to the irrevocability of the Persian laws, 2 days for the Jews to take vengeance, 2 letters instituting the commemoration of Purim. You see what I mean? There's just lots of literary structure that makes the reading of the book entertaining and lilting. I mean, it's just fun. And of course, that is celebrated by the Jews going forward. The book of Esther is a fun book. And so, every Purim in Orthodox houses, they will have traditional celebrations, which includes alcoholic drinking, because there's alcoholic drinking in the story, exchanging of gifts, games for the kids, and then it all climaxes with the reading of the book of Esther. And when it gets to this part, this is what the kids are all excited about. The kids can't wait to get to this part of the book. It says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. He's the Jew. I'm not going to do it. And they told Haman that he was a Jew. Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of the king of Ahasuerus, they cast pur, they cast lots, that's what the word comes from, before Haman day after day, and they cast it in month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. The casting of the lots is the calling on God in disguise. And everybody knows it. And they celebrate the turn of events that happens here. It looks like the Jews are going to be destroyed, and yet something happens to change the turntables, to wake everybody up. So the theological message of Esther is, when the writer of Esther has done, is to give us a story. This is a quotation from one of the guys. Giving us a story in which the main character is not so much as mentioned, but he's glaringly visible to everybody. He's glaringly aware. Everybody is glaringly aware that he is there. That's what I meant to say. There's only one answer to all these twists and turns. There's only one person who comes to mind when you read the story. It shouts from the lines of the book. The presence of God is implied and understood throughout the story, so that these mounting coincidences are but the byproduct of his rule over history and his providential care for his people. The story and the resultant holiday gives Jews comfort and assurance. You see that? The book is written to give comfort and assurance to the Jews in exile. Yes, Lamentations is right. The Lord punished you severely because you deserved it. But he is never thwarted by the works of man. We sometimes always think the works of man are those guys out there who hate Christianity and who hate the Jews. Works of man include us in our own faltering obedience. God's not thwarted by our own sin. He will bring about what he's going to do. Purim celebrates the advance of that promise. We are lousy, we are not worthy, but God is still on the move and he will bring his glory to bear. And so that it's just a moving forward. The face of God, again, comes out loud and clear in the book of Esther as well. You don't see God, you don't hear about God. God's not mentioned, but the face of God cannot be denied. He's there. His presence is intimate and not just fatalistic. God's electing purposes will not fail, and this story adds the next stage to redemptive history, which, by the way, leads to the coming of the Messiah. God is not done yet. That's the promise the Jews give us in the book of Esther. And the next thing is 400 silent years, so-called. And during those 400 silent years, the Jews go back to Lamentations. They don't pay much attention to Esther. Esther is a holiday book. They go back to Lamentations, and they see, yes, everything has happened because of our unfaithfulness. We need to change that corporately. We need to come back to God corporately. How do we do that? And Nehemiah comes along and he reads the law. And you remember that everybody spontaneously stood up at the reading of the law. They realized this is the truth and we have to obey this. And from that point on, governors for the people of God begin to organize, and they see their mission as one that holds and charges and calls people to orthodox account. We need to be careful to obey the law, and furthermore, we want to distance ourselves from doing anything that could be interpreted as sin, and so we're going to build a fence around the law so that we don't even come close to breaking it. That organizational group became known as the Pharisees. And they're the ones, for instance, that said, okay, we need to, the commandment says, do not take the name of the Lord in vain. So the fence of the law says, we're not going to name the Lord at any time. So the name of God is now forbidden, period. They come up with other names. That's where the name the Lord comes from, Adonai. It's where the word Jehovah comes from, although that's even a twisting of Yahweh. It's not even a legitimate name for God. We use it in songs, but its history is not clear. But Yahweh, the name of the covenant God, you don't speak that. You don't say that. The law says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Well, how do we do that? Work is one thing. What is work? And so they have to define work. And they decide that work out in the field, of course, is clear-cut. That's not the problem. But what about just simply moving about the house? And it got to the point that we'd finally say, if you drag a piece of furniture across your dirt floor in the house, you are plowing. You cannot do that on the Sabbath day. That's where all of those crazy extensions of the law of God come from. This bound and determined effort on the part of the Jews to be orthodox, so God will not judge us again. So, we have a sympathetic side in appreciating their determination, but in wanting to enforce that on the outside versus calling people to repent and live loving the Lord on the inside, they made it a burden to the point where Jesus rebuked them heartily and heavily for adding to the law when they had no business doing it. And the Pharisees themselves see Jesus as a threat because he is against the law. He's not against the law, he came to fulfill the law. But they see him as against the law because he's tearing down the fence. And that's intolerable. Okay. Any questions? Yeah, Tom.
Not a question, but a statement about Haman. Haman was they call him an Agagite.
Yeah, I didn't touch on that.
Right. Agag was the last
Right.
king of the Amalekites, actually killed by Samuel.
Yeah.
But there was still a little bit of lineage left, and that
Right.
went down to Haman. And then when Haman and his 10 sons were hanged, that totally wiped out the Amalekites.
Right. The whole thing with the Amalekites versus the Israelites goes all the way back to Joshua, and that's another part. I didn't get into that, but that's also a poetic line in there. Dan?
I know with Esther, Esther's, I guess, typically portrayed as kind of a hero, but another view would see her as more of an anti-hero. She should have gone back with the Jews. She shouldn't have been in it. All these things that were, perhaps not in line with the Lord's law. I just wonder if any thoughts there on should we hold Esther up or
Well, Esther starts off in the book not having a choice. She could have refused the king, and she would have had her head chopped off. And so going along with it was, you could make a judgment based on that if you want.
We lift up David.
But then Mordecai, in counseling Esther for that climactic moment when she walks into the throne room, it strikes me when I read that. He says, "Who knows but that you have been placed here for such a time as this." The verbiage there specifically doesn't say God's placed you here. Just who knows, And that's just another way that the literary writing of Esther excludes the name of the Lord. But yeah, I haven't seen anything specifically or strictly negative about Esther in that regard.